In the early years of World War II, one fact stands out as both simple and deeply unsettling. While Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were locked in a brutal struggle that consumed millions of lives, the Western Allies, Britain and later the United States, remained largely absent from the European mainland. From 1941 to mid-1944, the Red Army fought the vast majority of German divisions alone, suffering casualties on a scale almost unimaginable. Yet the long-promised Second Front in Western Europe did not materialize until D-Day in June 1944. Official explanations emphasize military unreadiness, logistical constraints, and strategic caution. But this raises important questions. If the Allies knew the Soviet Union was bearing the heaviest burden, why was the invasion delayed for so long? Were practical limitations the only reason, or were political calculations also at work? And did Allied leaders see advantages in letting Germany and the Soviet Union weaken each other first? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the scale of the conflict instantly surpassed anything the Western Allies were prepared for. Operation Barbarossa involved over 3 million German troops and opened a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Within months, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities like Kyiv and Smolensk fell, and Leningrad was placed under siege. By the winter of 1941, it was clear that this was not just another front, it was the decisive battlefield of the war in Europe. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin immediately pressed Britain for relief in the West. In telegrams and diplomatic meetings, he repeatedly called for an Anglo-American landing in France to draw German forces away from the Eastern Front. Winston Churchill's responses were sympathetic in tone, but vague in substance. He acknowledged Soviet sacrifices, but stressed that Britain lacked the means for a large-scale invasion. At first glance, this explanation seems reasonable. Britain in 1941 was still recovering from the fall of France and the evacuation at Dunkirk. Its army had lost much of its heavy equipment, its shipping was under constant threat from German U-boats, and its air force was still committed to defending the home islands. The United States, meanwhile, was not yet at war. Even after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American forces required time to mobilize, train, and transport across the Atlantic. Senior Allied commanders like General Marshall argued that launching a premature invasion could lead to disaster, strengthening Germany rather than weakening it. From this perspective, delay appears as caution, not calculation. But when we move beyond the surface, the timeline becomes more complicated. By late 1942, the United States was producing weapons, vehicles, and aircraft at a scale Germany could not match. American troops were arriving in Britain in large numbers, and Allied air power was steadily increasing. Yet, instead of invading France, the Allies chose to land in North Africa in November 1942, followed by campaigns in Sicily and Italy in 1943. These operations tied down some German forces, but they did not come close to relieving the pressure on the Eastern Front. Soviet losses continued to mount, particularly during the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. Stalin's frustration became increasingly explicit. At the Tehran Conference later in 1943, he bluntly accused his allies of dragging their feet while the Red Army did the real fighting. This raises an important question. If the Allies were capable of launching major operations in the Mediterranean, why was a cross-channel invasion still considered impossible? Some historians point to the immense logistical challenges of landing and sustaining millions of men across a hostile coastline. The English Channel, heavily fortified by German defenses, was not comparable to North Africa or Italy. Amphibious warfare on that scale had never been attempted. Failure, Allied planners feared, could not only cost lives, but potentially prolong the war by giving Germany a propaganda victory and crushing Allied morale. Yet others argue that strategy alone does not tell the whole story. Political considerations played a quiet but significant role. Churchill, in particular, was deeply skeptical of a direct assault on France in 1942 or 1943. His preferred approach emphasized peripheral operations, what he called attacking the soft underbelly of the Axis. This strategy aligned closely with British imperial interests in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It also reflected Britain's limited manpower compared to the United States and the Soviet Union. A failed invasion of France would have been catastrophic for Britain in a way it might not have been for its larger allies. There was also the question of trust. Despite being allies, Britain and the United States viewed the Soviet Union with suspicion. Stalin's pact with Hitler in 1939, the annexation of Eastern European territories, and the nature of the Soviet political system all shaped Western perceptions. Private correspondence among Allied leaders reveals a quiet anxiety about what a post-war Europe dominated by the Red Army might look like. Some policymakers believed that a prolonged German-Soviet war would exhaust both sides, reducing the threat posed by either after the conflict ended. This is rarely stated openly, but the logic appears repeatedly in diplomatic discussions and strategic assessments. Official explanations say the delay was unavoidable, dictated by material constraints and military prudence. But documents suggest that Allied leaders were also weighing long-term power balances. In 1941, Senator Harry Truman, who would later become U.S. president, famously remarked that if Germany was winning, the United States should help Russia, and if Russia was winning, it should help Germany so that both would weaken each other. While Truman later supported full cooperation with the Soviets, the comment reflects a broader strategic mindset that existed in parts of the Western political class. The war was not only about defeating Hitler, it was also about shaping the world that would emerge afterward. The delay of the Western Front also had profound human consequences. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Soviet Union had already lost an estimated 20 million people, military and civilian combined. Entire regions were devastated, cities reduced to rubble, and generations scarred by trauma. Soviet historians would later argue that earlier Allied action could have shortened the war and saved millions of lives. Western historians counter that a failed invasion could have had the opposite effect, strengthening German control over Europe and prolonging the conflict even further. Both interpretations rest on assumptions that cannot be fully tested, which is precisely why the debate remains unresolved. As 1943 drew to a close, the strategic situation shifted decisively. Germany had suffered irreversible defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and the Red Army was advancing westward. At the same time, Allied air campaigns were crippling German industry, and American troop strength in Britain reached levels sufficient for a cross-channel assault. At Tehran, Roosevelt and Churchill finally committed to a definite timetable for the invasion of France. But even then, the decision reflected not just military readiness, but urgency. There was growing concern in Washington and London that if the Red Army advanced too far into Europe before the Western Allies arrived, Soviet influence over the continent would be impossible to limit. This convergence of military capability and political necessity set the stage for D-Day. The invasion of Normandy would ultimately succeed, opening the long-awaited Western Front and accelerating Germany's defeat. But the years of delay before it occurred remain one of the most contested aspects of Allied strategy. Were they the result of unavoidable constraints or cautious choices shaped by fear, calculation, and competing visions of the post-war world? To answer that, we need to look more closely at what Allied leaders said publicly, what they discussed privately, and how their decisions aligned with the realities on the ground. The story of the delayed Western Front is not one of simple betrayal or hidden plots. It is a story of competing priorities in a total war, where every decision carried enormous risks and consequences. But it is also a reminder that alliances are rarely free of tension, and that even shared enemies do not erase conflicting interests. As we move deeper into this history, the line between necessity and choice becomes harder to draw, and the official narrative begins to feel less complete than it first appears. As Allied planning moved forward in 1943, the internal disagreements within the coalition became more visible. The United States, under President Franklin Roosevelt, increasingly favored a direct assault on Western Europe as the fastest way to defeat Germany. General Marshall consistently argued that every diversion into the Mediterranean delayed the decisive blow. His position was grounded in arithmetic as much as strategy. Germany's industrial heartland lay in Central Europe, and the shortest route to it was through France. British leaders, however, remained cautious. Memories of the First World War loomed large, especially the Somme and Passchendaele, where mass infantry assaults had produced staggering casualties with limited gains. Churchill, shaped by those experiences, feared that a premature landing in France could result in another bloodbath. This divergence in outlook was not merely tactical, it reflected different national circumstances. The United States possessed vast manpower reserves and an industrial base untouched by enemy bombing. Britain did not. By 1943, Britain had been at war for nearly 4 years. Its economy was stretched, its population exhausted, and its empire increasingly fragile. For British planners, delay was a way to minimize risk and conserve strength. This helps explain why operations in North Africa and Italy were consistently framed as necessary stepping stones rather than distractions. They provided combat experience for Allied troops, weakened Axis forces, and secured key sea routes. Official communiques emphasized these benefits, but they did not fully address why these operations were repeatedly prioritized over France. The Mediterranean strategy also had geopolitical implications. Control of Italy and the Balkans offered Britain leverage in regions it had long considered strategically vital. Some British officials feared that abandoning the Mediterranean could allow Soviet influence to spread unchecked into southeastern Europe. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals concerns about Greece, Yugoslavia, and the eastern Mediterranean falling entirely within Moscow's orbit. A Western Allied presence in these areas was seen as a counterweight, even if it did little to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. This suggests that the delay of the Western Front was tied not only to defeating Germany, but to shaping the political map of post-war Europe. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union watched these developments with growing suspicion. Soviet intelligence reports closely tracked Allied troop movements and strategic debates. From Moscow's perspective, the pattern was clear. The Red Army was fighting the main German forces, while the Western Allies engaged in secondary theaters. Stalin's speeches and letters became increasingly blunt. He warned that continued delay would undermine trust and raise doubts about Allied intentions. At the same time, Soviet propaganda emphasized the heroism and sacrifice of the Eastern Front, reinforcing the idea that the USSR was carrying the war almost alone. This distrust was intensified by the sheer imbalance in casualties. By mid-1943, the Soviet Union had already suffered several million military deaths. Entire age groups of young men were wiped out. In contrast, American casualties remained relatively low, and British losses, while significant, were far smaller than those on the Eastern Front. Some Soviet historians later argued that this imbalance was not accidental, but the predictable result of Allied choices. Western scholars tend to caution against such conclusions, noting that casualty figures alone cannot determine intent. Still, the disparity shaped perceptions on both sides and influenced post-war narratives. There was also the question of timing relative to Soviet advances. By 1943, it was increasingly clear that the Red Army would eventually push westward. Some American officials began to worry that waiting too long would allow Soviet forces to liberate and therefore dominate much of Eastern and Central Europe. This concern added urgency to planning for 1944, yet it also complicates the earlier delays. If limiting Soviet influence became a priority later, why was it not treated with the same urgency when the Red Army was on the defensive and desperately requesting relief? This apparent contradiction fuels ongoing debate about Allied motives. The Tehran Conference marked a turning point, but it also exposed lingering tensions. Roosevelt's role is particularly revealing. Unlike Churchill, he made a conscious effort to build personal trust with Stalin, believing that cooperation was essential for post-war stability. He supported the commitment to a 1944 invasion, partly to reassure the Soviet leader. At the same time, Roosevelt avoided confronting Churchill too directly over earlier delays, preferring consensus over confrontation. This balancing act may have smoothed Allied relations in the short term, but it left many strategic questions unresolved. By early 1944, the argument that the Allies were simply unprepared began to lose credibility. Troops were trained, landing craft assembled, and supply lines organized. The delay now appeared less about capability and more about timing. Launching the invasion too early risked failure. Launching it too late risked ceding Europe to Soviet influence. Normandy became the compromise, chosen not only for its beaches and terrain, but for what it represented politically, a clear statement that the Western Allies intended to play a decisive role in Europe's liberation. Yet even as plans solidified, uncertainty remained. Allied commanders understood that success was not guaranteed. Private letters and diaries revealed deep anxiety about the invasion's outcome. This fear reinforces the argument that caution was genuine, not merely rhetorical. But it also underscores how much was at stake. Every month of delay meant more Soviet deaths, more destruction in Eastern Europe, and a shifting balance of power that could not be easily reversed. Looking back, it is tempting to impose clarity on decisions made under immense pressure and uncertainty. The delay in opening the Western Front can be explained through logistics, strategy, politics, and psychology, and all of these factors mattered. But what makes this history so contentious is how these explanations overlap and sometimes contradict each other. The same decision can appear prudent from one angle and morally troubling from another. This tension lies at the heart of the debate and helps explain why the question of Allied delay continues to provoke strong reactions decades later. As the invasion drew closer, the narrative of inevitability took hold. D-Day would later be remembered as the moment when Allied unity and resolve finally translated into decisive action. But inevitability is often the story told after the fact. Before the landing, nothing was certain, and the years of hesitation weighed heavily on Allied relations. To understand why the Western Front opened when it did, and not sooner, we must continue examining not only what leaders claimed publicly, but how their choices aligned with the evolving realities of war and power. To fully understand the delay, it is necessary to look more closely at how the war was being interpreted inside Allied decision-making circles as a long struggle rather than a single decisive gamble. By 1942 and 1943, many senior planners in Washington and London no longer believed the war would be won by one dramatic stroke. Instead, they viewed it as a process of attrition in which Germany's strength would be ground down across multiple fronts. This mindset made delay appear not only acceptable, but in some cases strategically useful. If German forces were tied down in the east, bleeding men and equipment at a catastrophic rate, then time itself became a weapon. The longer the conflict lasted under these conditions, the weaker Germany would become before facing an Allied landing in France. This logic appears repeatedly in internal memoranda and strategic discussions. American and British planners closely monitored casualty figures on the Eastern Front, German tank losses, and the depletion of Luftwaffe units transferred eastward. The Red Army's ability to absorb losses and continue fighting was often described in Western assessments with a mixture of admiration and grim calculation. Official rhetoric celebrated Soviet resilience, but behind closed doors, that resilience was sometimes treated as a strategic asset that reduced pressure on the Western Allies. This raises an uncomfortable question. When Allied leaders spoke of the Soviet Union holding the line, were they expressing solidarity or acknowledging a reality that allowed them to wait? The issue of timing was also influenced by fear of repeating historical failure. The failed Allied landing at Gallipoli during the First World War haunted British strategic culture. Churchill himself had been closely associated with that disaster, and it left a deep imprint on his thinking. The lesson he drew was not simply that amphibious landings were risky, but that political pressure could force military action before conditions were ripe. This personal history helps explain his resistance to early proposals for a cross-channel invasion. What appeared to Stalin as reluctance or duplicity may have felt to Churchill like hard-earned prudence. At the same time, American confidence was not absolute. The U.S. Army of 1942 was still inexperienced, and early engagements such as Kasserine Pass exposed serious weaknesses in leadership and coordination. These setbacks reinforced the argument that Allied forces needed more time before facing Germany's main defenses. Training, doctrine, and command structures were overhauled in response. Supporters of delay later pointed to these improvements as evidence that waiting saved lives in the long run. Critics counter that these lessons could have been learned earlier had the Allies committed themselves more decisively to France. Another layer of complexity emerges when we consider intelligence. Allied intelligence services had limited insight into German defensive preparations along the French coast. The Atlantic Wall was partly real and partly a psychological construct, exaggerated by German propaganda, yet uncertainty about its strength played a powerful role in Allied caution. Planners feared mass casualties on the beaches and doubted whether supplies could be landed quickly enough to sustain a breakthrough. This uncertainty made delay seem safer, even as Soviet cities were being destroyed at an accelerating pace. The Soviet perspective on these calculations was understandably bitter. From Moscow, the idea that time was a weapon rang hollow. Time meant death. Every month without a Western front translated into hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. Soviet diplomats repeatedly reminded their allies of this reality. They framed the issue not only as a matter of strategy, but of obligation. The alliance, they argued, was supposed to share burdens, not merely coordinate victories. When these appeals failed to produce immediate action, suspicion hardened into a lasting grievance. This grievance would later shape how the war was remembered. In Soviet narratives, the delayed Western Front became evidence of Western indifference or cynicism. In Western narratives, the eventual success of D-Day retroactively justified the delay. Both interpretations simplify a more tangled reality. The delay was not the result of a single decision or hidden agreement. It emerged from a series of judgments made under conditions of fear, uncertainty, and competing priorities. Economic considerations also played a role that is often understated. The United States was engaged in a global war,
fighting Japan across the Pacific while preparing for Europe. Resources had to be allocated between these theaters. Roosevelt publicly committed to a Germany-first strategy, but in practice, political pressure after Pearl Harbor demanded visible action against Japan. This diluted the focus on Europe in 1942 and early 1943. Britain, too, was defending a global empire, stretching from India to the Middle East. These commitments did not make a Western front impossible, but they complicated the timing. There is also evidence that Allied leaders believed a later invasion would be more decisive and less costly. By waiting until German forces were weakened by prolonged fighting in the east and sustained bombing in the west, the Allies hoped to ensure rapid success once they landed. Normandy was planned not as a tentative probe, but as an overwhelming blow. In this sense, delay was part of a strategy aimed at certainty rather than speed. Whether this certainty justified the human cost borne by the Soviet Union is the moral question that continues to haunt the historical debate.
As 1944 approached, the language of Allied leaders subtly shifted. Public statements increasingly emphasized urgency and unity. Private correspondence reveals anxiety about Soviet intentions as the Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe. The delay that once seemed strategically comfortable now appeared politically dangerous. The same time that had weakened Germany was strengthening the Soviet Union's bargaining position. The Western Front was no longer just about defeating Hitler, it was about arriving in Europe before the post-war order was decided without Western input. This shift does not erase earlier explanations, but it reframes them. It suggests that the opening of the Western Front was driven by a convergence of necessity rather than a sudden moral awakening. Military readiness, political pressure, and geopolitical calculation finally aligned. The invasion happened not when it was easiest, nor when it was most urgently requested by the Soviet Union, but when the balance of risks tipped decisively in favor of action. Understanding this does not require condemning Allied leaders or absolving them. It requires accepting that wartime decisions are rarely made in a moral vacuum. They are shaped by memory, fear, ambition, and imperfect information. The delay of the Western Front was the product of these forces interacting over time, producing outcomes that were neither fully planned nor entirely accidental. As the Ally Armada gathered in southern England and preparations for Normandy reached their final stages, the war had already been transformed by years of bloodshed in the East. The question was no longer whether the Western Front would open, but what its opening would mean in a Europe already being reshaped by Soviet advance and German collapse. That question would only grow more complex once Allied troops finally set foot on French soil. When Allied troops finally landed in Normandy in June 1944, the operation was immediately framed as the long-awaited fulfillment of Allied unity. Publicly, it marked the moment when Britain, the United States, and their partners stood shoulder to shoulder with the Soviet Union in the decisive phase of the war. Privately, however, the landing also marked the end of a prolonged period of strategic ambiguity. The Western Front was opened not at the moment of greatest Soviet vulnerability, but at the moment when Germany was already retreating in the East. This timing is central to understanding why the delay remains controversial. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had recovered not only its strength, but its momentum. German forces had been shattered at Kursk, driven out of large parts of Ukraine, and were preparing to face a massive Soviet offensive in the east. Operation Barbarossa, launched just weeks after D-Day, would destroy entire German army groups and permanently cripple Germany's ability to resist. From a Soviet perspective, this sequence reinforced a lingering suspicion. The Western Allies entered Europe at the moment of German weakness, not at the moment of Soviet desperation. This perception, whether fair or not, would have lasting consequences for post-war relations. Western leaders were acutely aware of this optics problem.
Roosevelt, in particular, was sensitive to how the delay might be interpreted in Moscow. His correspondence shows repeated efforts to reassure Stalin that the invasion was not designed to minimize Soviet sacrifices or exploit Soviet success. Yet reassurance could not erase the historical record. The Red Army had already crossed borders and liberated territories that would soon become the Soviet sphere of influence. The Western Front, though decisive, arrived late in the race to shape Europe's future. At the same time, it would be misleading to suggest that the Normandy invasion was easy or risk-free simply because Germany was weakening. The landings faced fierce resistance, particularly on beaches like Omaha. Casualties were heavy, and success was far from guaranteed. Allied commanders later acknowledged that had the invasion failed, the political consequences would have been catastrophic. This reality supports the argument that caution had always been justified. The fact that the invasion succeeded does not automatically prove that it could have succeeded earlier. Still, the question remains whether the threshold of readiness was reached earlier than Allied leaders were willing to admit. By mid-1943, the Allies had air superiority over much of Western Europe, growing naval dominance, and increasing amphibious capability. Some American officers believed that a limited invasion in 1943, while risky, might have forced Germany to divert substantial forces from the Eastern Front. British leaders remained unconvinced. Their resistance was often framed as concern for Allied lives, but it also reflected a deeper strategic conservatism shaped by imperial decline and the memory of past failures. The human dimension of the delay is impossible to ignore. Soviet soldiers and civilians paid a price that dwarfed losses in the West. Entire cities were annihilated, and scorched earth tactics left lasting scars on the landscape. Western narratives often acknowledge this sacrifice but struggle to integrate it into assessments of Allied strategy. To do so would require confronting uncomfortable trade-offs between military prudence and moral responsibility. It is easier to celebrate eventual victory than to ask whether that victory could have been achieved sooner at a lower overall cost.
The delayed Western Front also shaped post-war political narratives. In the West, D-Day became a symbol of liberation and unity, a defining moment that justified years of preparation. In the Soviet Union, Victory Day centered on Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, reinforcing the idea that the war was won primarily in the East. These competing memories hardened into ideological positions during the Cold War, making objective reassessment difficult. Each side emphasized the facts that supported its version of events and downplayed those that complicated it. Some historians argue that the delay was ultimately beneficial, allowing the Allies to win the war with overwhelming force and minimal internal disagreement. Others counter that this view reflects the privilege of hindsight. The war's outcome does not absolve the choices that shaped its course. Documents from the period reveal leaders grappling with uncertainty, not executing a master plan. The absence of a single clear decision to delay does not mean the delay was inevitable. It emerged from a pattern of decisions that consistently prioritized caution over urgency. It is also worth considering how the delay affected Germany's conduct of the war. The absence of a Western Front until 1944 allowed Germany to concentrate the bulk of its forces against the Soviet Union. This intensified the destruction in the East and prolonged the conflict there. While Germany ultimately lacked the resources to win, the delay arguably increased the scale of suffering without altering the final result. This does not imply intent, but it highlights consequences that extend beyond strategic calculations. As Allied forces advanced across France and into Germany, the logic of delay faded into the background. The narrative shifted toward unity and shared sacrifice. Yet beneath this narrative lay unresolved tensions. Soviet leaders did not forget the years of waiting. Western leaders did not forget the fear of failure. These memories shaped negotiations over post-war borders, security arrangements, and spheres of influence. The delay of the Western Front was not just a wartime issue, it was a prelude to the Cold War.
By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the question of why the Western Front had been delayed was already being answered differently on each side of the alliance. In public, the story was one of careful planning and eventual triumph. In private, it was a story of mistrust, calculation, and missed opportunities. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes. As we step back from the battlefield and examine the decisions that led to D-Day, a pattern emerges. The delay was shaped by genuine constraints, but also by choices influenced by fear, memory, and political ambition. It was neither a cynical plot nor a simple necessity. It was a product of leaders navigating a war unlike any they had faced before, balancing immediate survival against long-term power. To understand the delayed Western Front, we must resist the temptation to reduce it to a single explanation. It was not just about landing craft or troop readiness. It was about how leaders understood risk, how they valued time, and how they imagined the world that would emerge after the war. Those imaginations influenced when they acted, not just how. As the guns fell silent in Europe, the alliance that had defeated Hitler quickly unraveled. The wartime delays, compromises, and suspicions that had been managed under the pressure of a common enemy now surfaced openly. The opening of the Western Front had helped win the war, but it could not resolve the deeper tensions that had shaped its timing. Those tensions would soon define the post-war world, casting a long shadow over the victory that D-Day symbolized. When we return to the questions raised at the beginning of this story, the picture that emerges is neither comforting nor cynical, but complex. The Western Front was not delayed because Allied leaders were indifferent to Soviet suffering, nor because they secretly wished Germany and the Soviet Union to destroy each other. At the same time, it was not delayed solely because landing craft were unavailable or troops were untrained. The truth sits uneasily between these explanations, shaped by how power, fear, and uncertainty interact in moments of crisis. One of the most revealing aspects of the delay is how rarely Allied leaders spoke in moral terms when discussing timing. Their language was overwhelmingly strategic. They spoke of risk, probability, sustainability, and end states. Human cost was acknowledged, especially in public speeches, but it was rarely the deciding variable in private deliberations. This does not make these leaders amoral, but it does remind us that in total war, moral considerations are often filtered through strategic logic. When time was treated as an asset, the fact that it was purchased with Soviet lives became an abstract calculation rather than an immediate constraint. This helps explain why the Western Front opened when it did. By 1944, the balance of factors had changed. Military readiness had improved, air superiority was largely secured, amphibious logistics were finally adequate, and Germany's ability to respond decisively was weakening. Just as importantly, the political cost of further delay had risen sharply. The Red Army was advancing into Eastern Europe, and Allied leaders increasingly feared that absence from the continent would translate into irrelevance at the negotiating table. Action became necessary not because delay was no longer possible, but because delay was no longer advantageous.
In this sense, D-Day was as much a political landing as a military one. It asserted Western presence in Europe at a moment when the shape of the post-war world was coming into focus. This does not diminish the courage of the soldiers who stormed the beaches or the difficulty of the operation itself. It does, however, complicate the idea that the invasion was simply the inevitable result of patient preparation. It was the result of converging pressures that made further hesitation more dangerous than action. The Soviet interpretation of the delay, forged through immense sacrifice, hardened into historical memory. From that perspective, the Western Allies arrived late to a war already won at unimaginable cost. This view was reinforced by the fact that the Red Army reached Berlin first and bore the brunt of urban combat at the war's end. Western interpretations, by contrast, emphasized the decisive role of industrial power, strategic bombing, and the Normandy landings in breaking Germany's remaining strength. These narratives were not just historical disagreements, they became foundations for Cold War ideology. What often gets lost in these competing memories is the fragility of Allied unity during the war itself. The alliance held not because of trust, but because of necessity. Each side assumed the others were acting in their own interests, and they were largely correct. Cooperation emerged not from shared values, but from overlapping goals that shifted as circumstances changed. The delay of the Western Front is best understood within this framework. It was a symptom of an alliance under strain, managing contradictions rather than resolving them. This also explains why the question of delay resists simple moral judgment. To say the Allies should have invaded earlier assumes that earlier invasion was both feasible and likely to succeed. To say they were right to wait assumes that prolonged Soviet suffering was an unavoidable price of prudence. Neither assumption can be proven. What can be shown is that leaders made choices based on incomplete information, historical memory, and competing fears. Fear of failure, fear of exhaustion, fear of post-war vulnerability. In recent decades, access to archives has deepened our understanding of these choices. Diplomatic cables, meeting transcripts, and personal diaries reveal leaders who were far more uncertain than later narratives suggest. They doubted their own judgments, argued fiercely with one another, and revised plans repeatedly. The absence of a single decisive moment where the Western Front was consciously postponed is itself revealing. Delay emerged incrementally through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. This incremental nature makes the story uncomfortable because it resists clear accountability. There is no single document where Allied leaders agree to let the Soviet Union bear the burden alone. Instead, there is a pattern of caution that, taken together, produced that outcome. History often works this way. Consequences arise not from intent, but from accumulation. The delayed Western Front also invites a broader reflection on how wars are remembered. Victors tend to frame outcomes as proof of wisdom. Success validates strategy, even when alternative paths might have produced different, possibly better results. D-Day success has long been used to justify the years that preceded it, but success does not erase the questions raised by delay, it only quiets them. When we strip away patriotic narratives and Cold War polemics, what remains is a deeply human story. Leaders trying to avoid catastrophe, soldiers enduring unimaginable conditions, and civilians caught between forces far beyond their control. The Soviet Union's suffering was real and overwhelming. The Western Allies' fear of failure was also real. Both shaped the timeline of the war in ways that still provoke debate. Returning to the opening questions, we can now see why they remain unresolved. Why was the Western Front delayed? Because leaders feared failure more than delay until delay itself became dangerous. Were practical limitations the only reason? No, but they were genuine and deeply felt. Did Allied leaders see advantage in letting Germany and the Soviet Union weaken each other? Some certainly recognize that this dynamic existed, even if they did not create it intentionally. The story does not end with a verdict. It ends with an understanding that history is rarely clean. The delayed opening of the Western Front was not the product of betrayal or brilliance alone. It was the result of competing priorities in a war that forced impossible choices. Recognizing this does not diminish the sacrifices made on any front. It places them within a fuller, more honest context. Perhaps the most important lesson is not about World War II itself, but about how we interpret power and alliance. When interests align, cooperation follows. When they diverge, even allies hesitate. The Western Front opened not at the moment of greatest need, but at the moment when risk, readiness, and future power converged. That convergence shaped the end of the war and the world that followed.
History usually remembers D-Day as a beginning, but when seen through the lens of delay, it also marks the end of a long period of calculated waiting. Understanding that waiting does not weaken the story of Allied victory, it deepens it, reminding us that behind every decisive moment lies a trail of hesitation, compromise, and unresolved doubt.